Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Julia Glass, and a second Julia, ASL interpreter Julia. Julia, our author, is the author of novels Vigil Harbor, A House Among the Trees, and The Dark Sacred Night, The Widower's Tale, The Whole World Over, and a National Book Award winning 3 Junes, as well as a Kindle Single, Chairs in the Rafters. I See You Everywhere, a collection of linked stories, won the 2009 SUNY, State University of New York, John Gardner Fiction Award. Julia's personal essays and short stories have been widely anthologized, and she has won fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She is co-founder of 20 Summers, a nonprofit incubator for arts and ideas in Provincetown, a board member of the Provincetown Book Festival, and a senior distinguished writer in residence at Emerson College. Julia is also an enthusiastic badminton player and lives in Marblehead with her husband and her 2 elderly corgis. I love corgis. In fact, I almost got a corgi.
Well, you may have spared yourself some trouble.
I don't know. I got an Australian Shepherd and they're also trouble.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. One kind of trouble for another kind of trouble is what you.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I thought their little legs were too short to keep up on with me on long hikes, so that's why.
You should see them run. It is hilarious. It's like some kind of Looney Tunes cartoon.
Oh,
We go to the beach, they'll spot the fastest dog on the beach, like a Vizsla or something, and off they go, like. So we have cardigan corgis. The Queen's corgis are Pembroke corgis. And as my husband likes to say, ours are the commoner corgis.
Oh,
They have these big, long, bushy tails and big, foxy ears, but they're very low to the ground. So
yes, very
they're
low.
fun. They're very amusing, which makes up for a lot.
Yes, that's very necessary. Anyway, getting away from dogs, tell me how you decided to become a writer?
Oh, well, writing decided to hijack me.
Oh, really?
So, so I was a very, very chatty child. I learned to talk very late, but as my mother said, my first words were a full sentence, which was bring a Kleenex, honey. So I I was a big storyteller. I loved reading. I mean, I read the way I breathed throughout my childhood. My mother used to say, "How can you read while setting the table?" In the car, she's like, "Talk to me. All you do is read." So, but I also loved visual arts. And when I went to college, I'd had amazing English teachers and art teachers in high school. And I went to college, not terribly certain what I wanted to major in. And I became much more enthralled with the visual arts, that part of me, than literature. Because this was in the mid 70s. And the teaching of literature was very tied up with deconstructionism and semiotics and this very highly cerebral way of looking at fiction and poetry, which it was very alien to me. So I followed my other love and I majored in art. And I went to Paris for a year afterwards and painted and went to museums. And then I went to New York, like all the artists who go there, to be an artist. But I ended up through my 20s supporting my life as a painter with my word skills. I was a freelance copy editor and proofreader. I worked for Cosmopolitan magazine. I worked for a number of different publishers. But all the time, painting and drawing was my focus. But at the same time, I read all the books I would have read if I'd been an English major. I read all the time. And around the time I turned 30, I realized that to me, the most moving work of art will always be a work of fiction. I still love going to museums, but I found that on weekends when I was supposed to be going to the Metropolitan Museum or MoMA, somehow my feet took me to the nearest bookstore. And so I started writing fiction for the first time since I'd been on the literary magazine in high school.
Wow.
And it was a tough period because I was making a complete change. I still had to pay the rent. I really couldn't paint and write fiction. And I had my first short story.
Your imaginative skills to be doing both?
Well, the problem was time.
Oh,
If I'd had a big trust fund and could have done both, great. But
Ah,
I so I for a while they overlapped, and then I realized I had to choose.
mm,
I chose writing, and it was actually a very difficult period for me because all my friends were sort of rocketing ahead in their professions, and I was kind of starting over. I mean, and why I didn't go to an MFA program, I don't know. I mean, and now I teach in an MFA program, and I understand the incredibly wonderful value of having a writing community because writing is a very solitary pursuit.
mm,
yes.
I'm not a cave dweller. I like being with people too. So, I, but it took me 7 years of submitting stories to get my first story published. And it was nowhere fancy, not the New Yorker, not the Atlantic. Why I didn't quit, I must have been crazy. I think, when people say, what does it take to be a successful writer? I say two things, determination and denial. Like, there I was, 37, and I finally get a story published. And then my first novel, Three Junes, was published when I was 46.
hmm,
And I got to play, skip ahead by winning the National Book Award for my first novel.
whoa.
That was when I first met, other published fiction writers, and
Mm,
suddenly I could talk shop.
mm,
Uh,
So
wow.
some things I did kind of backwards, but I'll also tell you that one of the questions that women writers get, not too many men get this question, because I have two kids, they're now in their 20s, but when Three Junes came out, they were little tiny ones. When Three Junes came out, they were less than a year and 5.
Oh,
oh,
And people say, how do you do it with children? And I
mm,
have to say, I did it because of children, because I realized once I became a mother that I had to support these little people along with their dad, but he was not an investment banker. And I thought either I write a novel and I get it published, or I go get a real job.
huh,
At the time, I made most of my freelance living from working for JP Morgan Chase.
oh my gosh. Yeah.
Well, you know what? They paid me an hourly wage that was about 3 times as high as I would make for a book publisher. And
Yeah.
it bought me a lot of time to be a writer. And, my father kept saying, why don't you just go and get a job at JP?
mm,
And it's not as if he didn't support my fiction writing, but here I was in my 40s. So that that's not exactly in a nutshell, is it? But that's how
I
I
don't like nutshells anyway. There's too much.
uh,
but the thing I say to my students, and my graduate students are mostly in their 20s, some in their 30s, and a few older. And I say, when I tell you the story of how I became a writer and when I published my first novel, some of you are going to be absolutely terrified, because you're in your 20s and you're like, no, 46, one foot in the grave. And
Gosh, stop that.
I said others of you are going to be inspired, but everybody gets there. The beauty of being a fiction writer or a poet is, you don't have to pass, you don't have to get certified the way lawyers or architects or doctors do. Because, as I like to say to my students, if we commit malpractice, the worst we can do is bore somebody or waste their money. We cannot transplant an organ or make a building fall down on their heads. We can't really, I don't think we can kill anybody.
I don't know. Those book pages, they can get pretty sharp sometimes.
That's right, paper cuts. So that's how I found my way, I think back to writing. And if I look back,
mm,
I think I was more made to be a writer, a language person, than although, look, I collect art and some of my paintings are up in this house and I love color. I miss that. That's the thing I miss about painting is expressing myself directly with color.
Oh,
But when I think about my years as a painter, I think of myself as somebody who lived in another country and was pretty fluent in another language for a
oh,
while.
wow.
And then I came. So
Huh.
that's interesting. That's really interesting. And I have to go back to this and please forgive me, but you said books can't hurt anybody.
well, kill anybody. They can, they
And
they
we're
can.
in a country where now there is book banning.
Yeah, it's it's appalling. And I mean, I live in Massachusetts, as do you. I feel very lucky to live in a part of the country where, at least I hope, those sorts of practices will not catch on. But we can't ignore that the culture of censorship, and of trying to, and I use this word ironically, shield children from, other cultures, other ideas about identity and gender, yes, but that just take you into different worlds. I mean, when I was a child reading, and I prided myself in reading ahead of my age. I'd go to the library and the things I read before I should have read them. But that's the first way that many children see worlds beyond their own.
Oh, yeah.
And if you take away, which is the intention, right? That's the intention, is to have children live only in the world that's controlled by the adults around them and values that they want those children to have. So I also, when I was in my teens, I read a lot of fiction in translation just because it was, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, I was pretty pretentious. And I loved carrying around books that said they were translated from the Swedish or the French or the Italian. I was like, yeah. So I don't think I even understood some of the things I read. But and the truth is that back then in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, there was a lot more fiction translated into English than now because of the bottom line. So yeah, I mean, book banning. What can I say? Yeah,
Scary.
it is. It's very scary. I mean, one of my students, graduate students who graduated, and she is a force of nature. And she grew up in Florida. She's a Cuban American. She wants to be a school teacher. And she said, I'm going back to Florida. And I said, do you know what you're getting yourself into? And she said, I don't care what they tell me. My classroom is going to be my classroom. And I thought, well, I hope that can be the case. So.
Well, we actually need people like her.
We do. We do.
We really need, and they need our support.
Yep.
Us forward. So what intrigued me about your books was that you bring forward the unexpected. There'll be this natural situation going around, and then there's something that we make assumptions about, right? That aren't what comes forward. And that's interesting to me. How do you come up with your situations and your characters?
So again, there's no rule book, right, on how to begin a novel. And I'm always
like, I told my kids, they'd say, how do you know how to do that? And I said, well, when you're born, there was a mommy book and I got it.
Yeah, but didn't you find that it was like no use whatsoever half the time?
There wasn't a mommy book and I never got it.
It wasn't a mommy. Oh, see, because I'm a reader, I read all those mommy books and then.
Well, I did too, but
okay,
yeah, you were talking beyond.
Christian would say, what are you reading? Just stop. So books can't tell you everything. It turns out. But so the way that a novel usually comes to me is in the form of a character who is in a pivotal situation. Perhaps that character, in 3 Junes, it begins with a man who's been widowed and he's coping with the loss of his wife and how to go forward with the relationships he has with his grown sons, because his wife has been the dominant parent, and the book sets out from there. My book, The Widower's Tale, and for some reason I like writing about older men, not all the time, but The Widower's Tale begins with a man who is retiring, and he lives in this beautiful town in Massachusetts, and he begins to notice that the world is changing around him in ways that he does not approve of. And then one of his grown daughters has a crisis in her life and comes home in her 40s, and he has to figure out how to deal with her crisis. So when these characters in these situations come to me, I don't worry terribly much about where I'm going to go. I do not plot the book out.
Uh,
What happens is I just start to write about the character, and I begin to think, well, does this character have siblings, children, co-workers? So that it's kind of like a tree. It's almost like the trunk is the protagonist, and these branches go off. And then, the plot is determined by the choices that the characters make. Now, I have never written a novel that's told from one point of view, and I'm not sure I'm capable of it. So what happens is other characters begin to sort of establish themselves. And sometimes a character that I thought I created as a boss or a child suddenly becomes another important point of view. So I also don't know right away how many points of view there are going to be. And my most recent novel, Vigil Harbor, and if you told me I was going to end up with this, I would have quit, said you're crazy. I ended up with 8 narrators and then a kind of omniscient narrator who comes in and out of the whole story. And, probably that book, I changed my mind more than any other book, how many people there were going to be, how many voices there were going to be. But I write, E.L. Doctorow said once, and I've got to memorize this quote, but he said that when he writes, he writes forward into the dark like a car driving across the country at night. And that he may know where his destination is, but all he can see is what's in the headlights, tarmac in the headlights. And that's the way that I write. And I also do not skip around. I don't write future scenes. I just sort of go forward and I come back, forward, back. So I don't write draft after draft after draft, which is what, by the time I get to the end, I've probably been working on the book for a couple of years, and I may completely surprise myself with how the book ends. It may be that I'll end up where I anticipated, but chances are I won't. And maybe that's what, when you say when you talk about the unexpected, maybe it's because it's often unexpected to me as well. But I do have to know at some point fairly early how this character is going to come to rest in the story. I mean, I like to think that for a reader, the ending of my books is a hopeful place, even if there have been deaths and losses. But I also like to think that the reader may imagine those characters going forward beyond the book. And that may be why sometimes I have taken up characters from previous books, again, that I didn't expect to. So Fenno MacLeod, who is the protagonist of 3 Junes, and who it was supposed to be his father who was the protagonist. And then I began writing about this son, and it felt as if he ran away with the story. And I wasn't done with him. It turns out that I was writing about what I thought were a completely different set of characters in my second novel, though they lived in the same part of New York City, because I was living in New York then. And I often write about the place I'm living in. And then suddenly I realized that one character's restaurant was on the same block as Fenno MacLeod's bookstore. And I thought, well, they both have dogs. What they've met when they walk their dogs. And so, and here's the other thing. The beauty of writing a novel is it's very private. So if you do something that you consider to be outlandish or, far-fetched, you say to yourself, well, that's okay. I'm making a fool of myself in private. So I'm just going to do this thing. I'm just going to follow my impulses, and then later we'll see if that works. And chances are, when I've done something impulsive, in some way, it's going to work. It just comes, from the unconscious, I suppose.
Are you impulsive in other areas of your life?
Am I what?
Impulsive in other areas of your life.
Well, I have been, but I'm not a daredevil. I'm a very cautious person physically. Everyone makes fun of me. I don't like heights. I don't drive fast. I don't, So if I have impulses, they might be that I'd paint a room a really bright color. This room is white, but other rooms in my house. I love your orange wall, by the way. I love orange, as you can see. So I've done impulsive things, but not physically impulsive. And but I would say that fiction is where I go out on a limb the most. And the other thing is, I'm writing about contemporary life. And Vigil Harbor, my most recent one, is actually it's set, if you do the math, in 2034. So when I was writing it, it was about a dozen years in the future. But that was the first time I tried something speculative. And it was, as I say, it was baby steps speculative. Though then COVID sort of whacked me over the head plot wise, and I had to figure out how COVID fit into the story. But, that's another story. But here's what happens when you're writing about contemporary life. I do not consider myself a political writer. But if my characters live their lives as I do and you do, they run up against politics. They run, my gay characters run up against bias against genderqueer people, or in one of my books, health insurance, and this was about 15 years ago, before Obamacare. One of my characters runs into trouble by being diagnosed with cancer and not having adequate health insurance. Now, I didn't intend for that to be a theme, but I was reading the paper, looking at the world around me, and trying to write a realistic book. So, that's, again, it happens to me in an unanticipated way. Because in fact, if I were, and there are writers, I think Barbara Kingsolver is a novelist who bites off big moral questions. And that's, how she begins a book. I think, I'm going to write about, like with Demon Copperhead. I heard a great interview with her. She really wanted to write a book about the opiate crisis in Appalachia. That's a huge subject. I could never dare to do that. So she said it was like a house that she was trying to get into. And she spent 2 years circling that house, figuring out, how do I get into this house that I want to get into? And it was through David Copperfield. It was through Dickens's novel. So that's a very different way of writing. My themes and any moral questions come in at me from the edges through the lives of my characters.
The way you describe your writing, it seems more like real life, where you can try to plan stuff, but you're not really sure what exactly is going to happen, and you're surprised by real world events. I don't know, I just get that sense very strongly. So
yeah,
is that
absolutely.
a way of describing your writing?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's an accurate description.
Okay, cool, thanks. Also, as you were a painter, I haven't read all your stuff. Have you ever written about a painter, or would you ever write about a painter?
Characters who are artists are very much a part of my work. Now, in 3 Junes, one of the most important characters is Fenno McLeod, who's a bookseller. Who doesn't what reader doesn't fantasize about being a bookseller? So that's how I fulfilled that fantasy. One of the other 2 main characters is a young woman who is, in Europe on a fellowship to paint. And that was very much based on my own experience. But I think that the book where I really decided I was going to sort of not tackle that, but where it came in was A House Among the Trees, which is the book that I wrote. It was published in 2017, before Vigil Harbor. And it grew out of my reading an interesting article about the children's book writer Maurice Sendak's estate and what became of his estate, which was a very gnarly and interesting story. So he basically left his entire estate, particularly his literary and artistic estate, in the hands of a young woman who had lived with him, not as a lover because he was gay. He had a long-time male companion, but she lived in his house and took care of things, whether she was a house manager or whatever. And to the shock of the literary world, she was in charge of the fate of all his work, reneged on a promise to a museum in Philadelphia that had believed they were going to. I mean, and when I read this story in the Times, what interested me was not really, Sendak it was this woman to whom he had left
Yeah.
control of this estate. And I thought, and who was being criticized right and left, that she wasn't qualified. And I thought, what would it be like to be that sort of helpmeet, that person who is the closest to the genius,
Yeah.
living, waking up, making meals, dealing with the genius's artistic life, their public life. What would it be like if that artist suddenly died?
Yeah.
You found yourself at the center of this storm of attention, and maybe you were a real introvert, and it's on you to decide
Yeah.
how this artist's legacy will go forward into the world. And of course, there are secrets that only you that you are the guardian of. So that's how the main character, and there are 3 points of view of A House Among the Trees, is this woman who on the first page of that novel, the great children's book artist and illustrator whom she has worked for decades has died very suddenly in a very stupid accident at his house. And there's also an actor. And at the time, my older son was a passionate actor in college, and we would talk a lot about acting. And I thought, well, this is my book to really write about, creativity, right? But also, if you are the guardian of a famous person's legacy, how much do you owe that person in terms of their privacy, or what do you owe the world and what do you owe that person? And so in that, and one of the things I really loved doing in that book was I invented books that the writer had written and illustrated. And I described the illustrations, and so I have to say, I've never had so much fun. Right.
Okay, cool.
I was in heaven, and I don't think there's a sequel, but who knows? And also I did, some people said to me, well, why don't you write a biographical novel about Maurice Sendak? And I said, no, I'm not interested in that. Somebody else can do that. It would be fascinating to research it, but the other thing is, I'm a big reader, but I don't tend to read biographies. I'll read profiles in magazines, but I'm also a really slow reader. For some reason, every biography of every great person is 900 pages long.
Yes.
I can't carry it around in my purse, and I'm not an e-reader. So, but really, I just, no.
Yeah. No, I get
So,
it. Well,
yes.
I cut this short at this moment, but we're out of time here.
Oh, okay.
So thank you so much for coming to talk with us.
Thank you.
Julia. It's been fascinating.
Yes.
To hear Julia's works, please join us at our art gallery during our November Arts Saturday. Register at Eventbrite. You can purchase her books on our online bookstore. That's bookstore.org/shop/Drake-It-Arts. I'd like to also thank our generous donors for making these programs possible. And here you have a whole list of them, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council, which gave a grant through the Drake-It Cultural Council. If you'd like to be a donor, please get in touch with us at drakeitarts@gmail.com or go to drakeitarts.com/donate. For more information about our Art Saturdays and our other programs, visit our website or email us at drakeitarts@gmail.com. This and all our programs are archived on the Drake-It Arts YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@DrakeItArts.